What an exciting talk. The last talk of our morning session is also really exciting because it touches one of the topics that is really dear to many of you, that is how much it's worth. What are the trends of the market? How the prices are evolving in different categories of color gemstones. And we have with us Brecken Branstrator. I hope that I say your name correctly. She's editor-in-chief of GemGuide, and maybe you know GemGuide for Gem World International, that was founded by our colleague Richard Drucker, and now is led by Stuart Robinson in Chicago. And she's an editor and a trained gemologist as well, and she will share with us how prices have been evolving lately. So thank you very much for coming, Brecken. The stage is yours, and looking forward to your talk today. I thank you.
Move these down since we've gone from the tallest gemologist to one of the smallest. Thank you all so much for being here today, for hanging in with us on the last day. I want to start by thanking ICA for the invitation to speak today. It's my first Congress, and I'm having the best time. Thrilled to be in Brazil with you all. And thank you, of course, to IBGM for hosting this wonderful event. It's been fabulous. As Rui mentioned, I'm the editor-in-chief of the GemGuide. For those of you who may not be familiar with the GemGuide, we are a bi-monthly publication. We track wholesale prices very closely, some diamond, but mostly colored stones. So at this point, we've got about 60 pages of wholesale pricing for color that we update as needed every issue, depending on what's going on in the categories. So with that in mind, we're sort of in constant contact with a lot of different levels of the trade. We speak to wholesalers often, frequently, to get market research and trends. And we're pretty in touch with what's going on in the market. So I'm here today to offer a little bit about what we've been hearing lately for what is driving the colored stone market forward. Sorry. Thank you so much. So to kick it off, to sort of establish what the market's been doing lately, I wanted to take a look at performance over the past few years before we look ahead. And I think, as we all know, starting with the pandemic, we saw really strong performance for color. It was certainly a tale of two markets, depending on which of the parts of the supply chain you were talking about. A lot of areas really hurt during the pandemic, but when we look at demand and sales, starting with 2020, we were hearing record years for a lot of wholesalers and jewelers as well. That strong performance really continued through about 2022. And then at that time, we were hearing that the market was quieting just a little bit. Not necessarily that things weren't going well, but it was sort of a reset of the market to pre-pandemic levels. And then so far in 2025, as we know, there's a little bit more caution in the market for obvious reasons. So we're seeing things slow a little bit, narrowing in trade activity. And, as production, we've heard a lot about production being limited. That scarcity continues to support the price levels right now. The biggest threat that we're seeing for what could change pricing, what could affect that, is whether or not consumer buying declines. So we're certainly going to keep an eye on that. Getting close to seeing what happens with consumers in terms of their fears with tariffs and economic policies and what have you. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the trends that have shaped the market in recent years and the ones that we think are really going to continue to develop it into the future. Starting with the big ones, Rui mentioned price, of course, and supply. So we've talked about this already, this conference, but one of the main issues and one of the main talking points we keep having with the trade is how limited supply is, how hard it is to get material, especially on the fine and extra fine, and just overall remains really limited. When you combine that with, during COVID, we heard that a lot of source countries were losing miners who were going to find other means of making money, and they didn't all return, so there was not much production coming out, sort of been slow to come out of that. When you combine that with the fact that there haven't been many big finds in recent years, as well as a lot of geopolitical developments in source countries that I'll talk about later, more countries trying to retain value in country, all of that has combined to just a really tight supply right now. And so not surprisingly, what we're seeing is very high prices for color, especially in fine and extra fine. I've only been at GemGuide for 2.5 years now, but I've been trying to keep up with what our research director, Stuart Robertson, tracking what he changes every issue. And in 2.5 years, I've not seen color go down in the pricing that we list, maybe one tiny category in one stone, but I think that's a good indicator of what's going on right now, just pretty high. And I note this second one because starting about Tucson 2024 and even into this year, wholesalers were more hesitant to sell their goods, knock off any of the price, because they were realizing not only that they had to source, but that they'd be sourcing at higher prices moving forward. So trade activity was a little bit quieter this year in Tucson. And I bring all this up not only to state the obvious about where prices are going, where they are right now in the market, but also because these supply and price factors are really influencing a lot of what we're seeing in the buying trends right now. But before I get into those buying trends, our ever popular historic price charts, starting with Ceylon sapphires, just to give you guys an idea of what has happened. Obviously, this is a longer look at pricing. But sapphire continues to be a very strong seller in the trade, one of the tops, no surprise there. And we see Sri Lankan materials currently being the benchmark for pricing there. It used to be Myanmar, but obviously with an inconsistent supply, the geopolitical issues tampering demand in the West, Ceylon sapphire really is the benchmark for price for blue. So here's an idea of the past 2 decades plus of what's going on. So you can really see a major change there in those top qualities. Red spinel is kind of an interesting one to look at. Spinel, since 2020, I would say, dealers have been saying spinel is flying off their shelves, sort of across the board, all colors. Red spinel is kind of interesting because it's benefited from the high price of ruby, so people finding their way to red spinel as sort of a color substitute. That being said, supply, as we know, isn't very big for red spinel, so demand continues to push price up, as we can see. And note this is 1 carat pricing for red spinel, and of course, when you get into the larger sizes, the price history, the price gap ends up being significantly higher when we look at how much it's gone up there. And then just to take a look at a classic staple, even in peridot, as we can see, supply tends to be a little bit more stable there. Demand tends to be a little bit more stable. It's a classic, but even when you look at the affordability, even in the past 2 decades, that price has doubled in fine and extra fine. So just across the board, continues to go up. And I wanted to note rough prices. I'm not going to get too much into the hard details of this because we don't track rough prices specifically as we do faceted goods. But what we were hearing, especially this year in Tucson, is that rough across the board is very high in price. Anecdotally, we think that can be attributed to a few different things. And number one is, of course, that limited production in the market right now. So prices are just very high, as well as, interestingly, I think when you talk about stones like garnets and tourmalines, rough prices are very high right there because of this idea of the responsible sourcing programs that's going on in some of these source countries. And those stones tend to be the focus of some of these. So rough prices there are pretty high as well. And also this idea of e-commerce, people earlier in the supply chain having access to the internet and trying to sell in different social channels and sell that way, as well as just having internet accessibility to see what people might be asking for their faceted goods and trying to raise their rough prices based on that. And now getting into the buying trends, I mentioned that this supply and pricing is really forming a lot of what we're seeing for buying. And I would say right now that buying seems to be across the board more than ever before. Usually when we're in Tucson and we're talking to the exhibitors, there is maybe one stone or one color that tends to stand out in terms of what people are telling me that they're selling. And this year it seemed to be really across the board. There wasn't much that was in common between a lot of dealers. We saw, as we note here, the biggest, widest array of stones beyond the big three. Now, obviously, you go to Tucson for that anyway. You want to see all the special and interesting goods, but this year buying was really going outside of these traditional categories into new material. We're seeing a lot of color being used in new places, a new opportunity for colored stones. Opaque stones, hard stones being the center of new lines. I think of Palmolato, that brand we all know. They have done for a few years now a collection of really big cocktail rings, and they're putting malachite and lapis and opaque rhodochrosite at the center of them to sort of celebrate this kind of material. For the past few years, right after the pandemic, we were also seeing a lot of designers at the Couture show in Las Vegas that many of you might know is really an indicator of what's going on in fine jewelry design. And there was a lot of enamel accents for a few years. And now we've seen that sort of quiet down. And in place of that, they're using opaque stones as accents, and they're doing really cool things with it, like herringbone patterns, mosaic patterns. And then out of reports from Watches and Wonders Geneva this year is interesting to me is that there's reportedly a lot of color being used on watches, not only enamel and lacquer on the dials, but also ornamental stones, as we can see in this photo. That's lapis and chrysoprase, I think. Can't see that. So there's lots of opportunity, lots of new buying trends going on for sort of widening the market for color. And then out of the Hong Kong show in the spring, and I would be curious if other people were seeing this as well, we have a Chinese correspondent who goes to the shows for us and writes reports and talks to the exhibitors. And he was saying that he had a lot of exhibitors telling him that they were looking for estate jewelry again. And again, this goes back to the idea of high prices, sourcing not only the estate jewelry, but potentially looking for what opportunity lays in colored stones in that category. And we also noted starting last year and certainly into Tucson this year that gemstone beads are on the uptrend. We know that's a very classic style, so it's not like this is a new trend that's coming in, but there's definitely increased interest in it. And we think that's really for a few different reasons, and obviously price has a lot to do with it. As we know, gemstone beads don't take as high of a quality of a stone, so it offers a really good price opportunity. So these designers are looking at big and small, but in general, strands with really good color that offers really good opportunity. And as we all know, the gold price right now is at a record high. So some of these exhibitors were telling us that they think it's designers looking for alternative ways of, instead of offering a solid gold chain for their necklace, a nice beaded necklace. And going back to this idea of widening buyer preferences than ever before, here's some examples of where I think this gets really interesting, what buyers are looking for, including, I think a lot of this has to do with marketing and how these wholesalers are finding new ways to market as well. But starting last fall, we were hearing increased interest in what people were referring to as opalescent sapphires. And what they were really talking about there was just sapphires with a lot of silk needles in them, so much that it sort of took on a hazy appearance. But with the designer crowd, that has been very popular. Green Couprian tourmaline is kind of an interesting trend we've been tracking. Just as a note, GemGuide uses Couprian to talk about all sources. We only refer to Paraíba unless it's from Paraíba. So here I mentioned this for both Mozambique and Brazilian material. But last year we heard some exhibitors saying that they were getting increased interest from a lot of designers in this material. Obviously, it offers a better price point, but it still has sort of the cachet of that beautiful neon blue that we all know and love, and it tends to be cleaner material as well. So that's sort of an interesting area that designers are finding their way into. And then, party sapphires, interesting stones. I specifically think of the ones from Australia that have the cool blues and yellows. Bicolor anything right now seems to be very hot, but they're cutting it in ways that maybe isn't such a specific delineation in the stone between the bicolor. They're sort of celebrating the colors for what they are. We are also I've been seeing a lot of, cutters celebrating the imperfections in stone. So they maybe are taking, for example, the growth zones of corundum and cutting it so that you can see it right under the table, which is kind of interesting. So there's definitely a growing interest in this material that is perfectly imperfect, as we say. And I actually had, I was at the J in New York show this spring, and I had a designer come up to me and she said, I want to create an entire line using just imperfect stones. Can you direct me? She said imperfect, but with great clarity. So that unclear what she meant by that. But I do think that's very indicative of where the market is today, that she wanted to do a whole jewelry line based on that. And again, going back to this same idea of how they're being marketed and how designers are accepting using color substitutions and finding their ways into different materials, as well as being more accepting of new colors in traditional stones, things that maybe haven't traditionally been seen as the ideal. So for example, here we have this blue sapphire from Montana that's being marketed as the denim sapphire. As well as neon green beryl. There's an exhibitor in Tucson who has some very light green beryl, but it has a lot of beautiful life to it. It's very vivid, so they market it as neon green, and from what I can tell, they struggle to keep it in stock because it's so popular with designers. And interestingly, using opaque ruby and sapphire, and not just in things that are obvious like cabs, but doing interesting things like bullet shapes, domes. There's a lot of slices and rose cuts in these materials even. And just to go back to the idea of pricing and what's going on in here, this is something I just wanted to bring up that we've been noticing, which is we've been hearing that the cost of Melly has been a little bit high lately as well due to higher cutting costs, which is tempering demand for smalls in the US market. We're seeing that clear evidence of this trend. Even though smalls can be machine cut, labor is still a big factor. There's still a lot goes into it. So the labor versus final price driving price up for this. There's a shortage of goods on the market right now. And what we're seeing is that sales of the big three now are pretty much single stone sales. And along the same lines, we sort of always are, I think there's a conversation around whether or not the synthetic color market could go the same way as synthetic diamonds. And I think we all know that this has been around for a long time, doesn't seem to be a threat. When I check in with the labs, there doesn't seem too much difference right now. So that's interesting to note. One of the things I think it's interesting in this area to talk about is conversations with wholesalers, just a few who are saying that they are seeing more synthetic Melly on the market in parcels. Now I add a caveat for this because when I hear synthetics in the market, I instantly go to the labs, and I canvassed a few in the industry to see what they were noticing in the area of Melly. And it was hard to substantiate because obviously a lot of them aren't screening colored stone Melly, or if they are, the one I think that said they do screen, they have higher end clients. So they're sending in their goods and they probably already know what they are. So they're not expecting synthetics. But I do note this because I think it's interesting that we are hearing sort of rumblings from some wholesalers that they are noticing it. They're a little bit concerned about it. So I just bring this up not to freak anybody out, but just to add this idea of the conversation is there and to reiterate the importance of due diligence and looking at your goods. And I'm gonna jump into tariffs super quickly though. I'm not gonna get that far into this because we heard so much from Sarah, and I love Sarah so much, I don't want her to come for me. So I don't wanna say anything that's not right. But I think it's really hard to talk about the current market outlook when you're not addressing the negative impacts that it could have when we're looking to the future for color. We know that it's directly stifling consumer spending, and it will influence the gem trade. It has already. We've heard of order cancellations, memo deals halted, that kind of thing. We know goods were sort of paused for a while with the gem labs in the U.S. Because they were subject to the duties. So the question mark for us now is, will they affect sales? Will the market pull back a little bit, and if so, how much? We heard Sarah talking about the people that were trying to move their goods into the US as quickly as possible. And on our end, we were also hearing conversations of dealers wondering if they're going to have to rely on old stock, what that might do to their inventory. And, I think the question was asked whether or not part of this conversation could be what it will do to markets in terms of if people start looking to different hubs for different things, which interestingly is something that we've heard too, from a very small base, but we've heard a few wholesalers wonder potentially about, if we cut goods currently in China now, will we have to look elsewhere to get our goods cut to take into account those tariffs. So I think it's definitely an idea that's floating around. We'll see what happens there. And of course, I think you can't forget about the concerns that are happening, especially with some of these responsible sourcing programs, of what might happen on the ground with some of these communities as the costs go up and that kind of thing, how those markets might be affected as well. And beyond just the US's activities lately, I mentioned earlier there's an increasing amount of source countries focusing on working to retain more value in country with various policies, with various levels of success, but it has, with a few of these, hampered trade a little bit, so I think they're of note. For example, Kenya last year enacted a strategic minerals plan where they identified, I think it was 12 different minerals that were important to them. They were going to try to reevaluate the process for exporting those and trading in those. Savorite, garnet was considered one of them, so for a while there wasn't much trading going on for savorite. I reached out to a correspondent we have on the ground in Kenya, and he said that there was a recent reshuffling in their Ministry of Mines, so they're hoping that they'll get savorite removed. But for now, he said they are exporting as grossular garnet in an attempt to keep trade going. Zambia, I think it was right around Tucson, Zambia put a 15% export duty on precious gems, which was on top of 6% royalty tax, which meant their tax on revenues was 21%. And when you compare this with the competitors for emeralds, of course, it sort of put them in a non-competitive state. And within about a month, they had reversed it. But one that is still currently ongoing is Malawi. Earlier this spring, they put a temporary halt on gem exports. They said at the time that it was indefinite. The trade came back and then sort of took issue with it, so they put a 21-day cap on it for no gem exports. And from one local source that I talked to right before I came here, it is still on. They're still not allowing any gem exports out of there. So nothing is flowing out of Malawi. And moving on to some new players, new changes, and new opportunities. Color. We sort of mentioned this already, but the diamond market upheaval is providing some opportunity in color. We have noted more companies that were maybe exclusively diamonds before, trying out color, either in loose goods or diamond brands adding color to their jewelry lines. Not really a new trend, but definitely picking up the pace and reflective of a market sort of supporting a balance of the two. So they're not necessarily leaving diamonds, but finding a way to add both to their inventory. Sort of started with small independent designers and custom jewelers, and now is moving in towards the mainstream, including some of the majors. And a lot more designers as well, designers that were exclusively diamonds, trying their hand at color. And tenders, I won't go into this too much because we heard a great talk from Tim, but I do think it's interesting to note because we are seeing an increased interest in tenders as a method of sales for color. I think there are a few, it allows for their material to reach a wider global audience, of course. I think there are two really good examples that I find really interesting in this space. And the first is, of course, Belmont. using their tenders, they've really leveraged the tender system well to gain an international awareness for their emeralds, sort of helping raise the perception in the global trade. And we know as their auctions attract an increasingly qualified buyer level that it really reflects the growing recognition and acknowledgement of the quality of their emeralds, and is sort of helping set them apart in the market for Brazilian emeralds. And they, of course, continue to make investments to the process. We've heard from Marcelo talk about the technology, and they're doing a lot to ramp up their production in that area as well to keep up with that demand. And the other interesting one, I think, is Potentate. You guys might know Potentate as the Rock Creek sapphire miner. They started doing international tenders last fall, I want to say, maybe, yeah, okay. They did their first in Bangkok last fall, and I talked to someone on the team in Tucson this year, and he seemed very, very happy with the turnout of it. A lot of interest in that event, sort of material across the board. And I think it's really interesting because we've been hearing that a lot of American gems tend to be local markets now, and Rock Creek, with the exception of Rock Creek, Potentate has the production there to not be a local market, and now they're driving into the international market, which is really cool. And the other thing to note about tenders is from GemGuide's perspective, they're interesting because depending on the category, of course, certainly not the case for everything, but we do note, as Tim said, depending on the tenders, there can be some sort of instability with pricing. And for some of the categories, we certainly do note that the tenders are starting to affect them. And I specifically talk about Mozambique rubies. As we know, the big players in Mozambique rubies are all going through tenders. So GemGuide in its last issue, based on what we were hearing from a few of the recent tenders, did raise up our fine end of Mozambique ruby pricing. Commitment jewelry. So going back to the idea of more areas of opportunity for color, the rate of growth for color in the category has really accelerated. One of the big things we were noting from Vegas last year is that it's really a crucial component in the bridal space. Diamonds, of course, still rule, but we saw that it's no longer sort of on the fringe, but rather a mainstream design component in bridal right now. We don't really think this is necessarily price related as much as just this natural consumer trend of focusing on story, style, personal expression, and how color can help them do that. So while diamonds are still dominating that part, color's gotten a lot of attention. And I note here, sapphire remains the top, but we've got ruby and emeralds showing up a lot, as well as in Vegas, we were seeing a lot of really cool stones also in bridal lines. As you can see here, spinel, peridot, lots of garnets being used, so lots going on there. And also interestingly to note, I saw an article in Rappaport this spring about the color market, and going back to Liebisch, they do the fine end of colored diamonds and really fine color. And I have a quote that they said, in the bridal segment specifically, the market share of colored gemstones rose for them to 15% last year. And also just to quickly touch on this idea of trade shows, this conversation started for us right around the time of the pandemic, but when companies were starting to reevaluate how they were doing business, this conversation of where to do that came up. And what we're hearing now a lot too is, with the exception probably of Tucson, is where the colored stone trade will start doing that. We are very curious what's going to happen in Las Vegas. I think there's a lot of concern for color and loose goods there. Whether people will come or be reluctant to sort of bring their inventory in with everything that's going on. I do think, even before this conversation happened, it seemed like JCK presence of color was shrinking a little bit. And we're hearing a lot more attraction to these smaller curated shows. So the two that keep popping up are Gem Geneve and Inorgenta. We heard a lot of positive feedback about Gem Geneve this year specifically. We know they were expanding their footprint. And so I think there's a lot of optimism around that as an option for color. And of course, it wouldn't be a colored stone conversation without talking about responsible sourcing. So one of the biggest and most interesting trends I think we're seeing in this space now too, in terms of traceability, is this idea that more miners are collaborating directly with designers. Allows them like new channels to market more materials, new ways of telling their stories, and of course it shrinks the supply chain for the designers who are maybe favoring being able to offer that kind of story. And I think I list here a few of the companies that have been doing this. We saw it start with Gemfields. They started just doing collections around their rubies and emeralds with designers. Muzo, the mining company Muzo, did it a few years ago with some of their lower quality goods, their more commercial goods, as a way of marketing tumbled and cabs and that kind of things. It was actually really cool. Cuprian and Company is a mining company out of Mozambique, and they, I mentioned the trend earlier of green Cuprian material. They've sort of grasped onto that really quickly, and right in time for Tucson this year, they launched a whole collection with some really good high-end designers, like think Stephen Webster, to sort of showcase what this material could offer, the arrays of greens that were there. And I have to mention Cruzeiro, of course, not only for our host country, but because it's one of my favorites to talk about. But during the pandemic, Cruzeiro turned inwards with their supply and said, how can we work with Brazilian designers? They launched a gorgeous collection with their own gemstones in couture. And it was just really cool to have that whole Brazilian story. This lovely photo is one of my favorite pieces from it, from Sao Paulo-based designer Richard Fisman. And one of the areas, the new areas of opportunity in this space that sort of aligns with what's also happening in buying trends is this idea of using more qualities of goods as a way of being more responsible in your sourcing. So this is an Instagram screenshot that I grabbed a while ago, and he just brings up the idea of if it's ethical to only be buying a certain percentage of goods. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts on that, but I thought it was an interesting point because he continues, do you think it's ethical for a small percentage to actually get purchased? We realized this disconnect very early on and have been incredibly intentional with buying, sourcing, cutting, showcasing, and using so much of this material that was overlooked for so long. And I think this could really align with what a lot of designers are already wanting to do in terms of the interesting material, what's not already in the market. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in cutting as well, unique cuts. There's a lot of, especially US-based cutters, I think, that are sort of starting with the material and adapting their cuts to that. So I think this is all just, this trend of more materials really playing into this space well, sort of overlapping with a lot of the buying trends that we're seeing. And we mentioned traveling to the source, I think, in one of the sessions as well, which is certainly something we've been hearing more about, both from designers and retailers. There are a lot more people in the trade farther along the supply chain that are showing interest in traveling to the source, seeing directly where their goods are coming from, being able to tell that story themselves. There are whole companies and groups that are being started around this trend. To take people on these adventures. And I really like this quote. I pulled it from GemGuide. Some of you might know Lisa Konigsberg. She does the IAC conference in New York, and she went to the Cruzeiro mine a few years ago, and I asked her to talk about why their work was critical and what that meant to her. And she offers this idea that, you know, the committing to responsible sourcing is in line with who you are. Therefore, it's critical to offer as many experiences, perspectives, and points of view as possible, and then invite people to experience them. And I really liked that idea because as somebody who has been in some mines and had the opportunity to do that, I do think it is sort of pivotal to changing your thinking and understanding the supply chain and being able to understand what's going on in the market. I will add, though, that I was speaking to somebody about this trend, somebody who visits the source a lot, and he raised the concern, though, on the other side of security issues. And, you know, as more designers travel to some of these smaller mines and they're posting where they are. Security issues can arise with, suddenly maybe locals know that someone has hit a pocket and what could go on there. So I think it's something for the trade to address as this becomes clearly more of a movement. Some interesting things going on in technology shaping the space, blockchain being the obvious one, as we know. AI, I think, is coming in a really interesting way in color. AI machine learning is obviously used for diamond grading already, but there is a lab in Europe who is now using AI machine learning for origin determination. And on a smaller role, the growing role of tech and exploration, not an area that tends to get talked about so much in the trade, but one I find really interesting. And I bring this up because there was a really cool article in GemA's magazine a few years ago about a researcher who was using drones for exploration of peridot in Canada. I don't know much of geology, but from what I can tell, those deposits look visually very different. So he was able to use a nice drone to sort of look through the area and see what the possibilities might be. When I asked him more about the changing tech in the space, he's still doing research, so he wasn't going to give me much, but he did say the future of ruby and sapphire exploration, at least as I see it, is being developed using a combination of solid, tried and true geological approaches, customized to target corundum, in addition to using modern tech to increase efficiency. And I bring this up because during a time when supply is so limited and we're also hopeful for that next big find, this could be a really cool space to watch about what goes on there. And just to close it all out, sort of bring it back to base, this idea that when it comes to the changing perceptions of value in the trade, as we know, no longer just the 4 Cs. Obviously, color remains there. We heard that a stone still needs to be pretty, but I think what more buyers are defining as pretty is changing pretty quickly, as well as things like what you can offer your buyers in terms of, can you offer traceability, what you're doing for your supply chain, do you offer something unique and special, what's your story? And we know that there are 2 wonderful examples here in Belmont and Cruzeiro that can do that in Brazil. So amid a smaller supply, buyers are finding this value in more material than they ever have before. And funnily enough, this is the same survey that was in Cheatham's speech. We pulled the same thing. It's almost like we run in the same crowds. So just to remind you, this was in Gems and Gemology a few years ago. This was the Instagram survey taken of the crowd is between 18 and 35, asked to choose what's most important to them when they're buying color. And the top choice was aesthetics and preciousness. And I specifically pulled out part of this that I thought was very indicative, being young designers favored uncommon and original gemstones with distinct and extravagant colors. While designers sought uniqueness, rarity, and extravagance, potential end customers were also looking for a gemstone with a story to tell. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Don't leave the stage so yet. Thank you. It has been really enlightening to see how trends are going in so many other perspectives. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I have one. Yes, you mentioned how gold prices have been affecting how lower priced products are being more trendy, like the drilled beads, for example. Is that the same situation for some Brazilian color gemstones like amethyst, citrine, rock crystal, blue topaz, etc.?
In terms of demand?
Yes.
Yes, certainly. I think that's very much the case, that they are finding their way into some of these more affordable goods and finding, still really good color, like I mentioned, but yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. There is one question. Yes, Brian.
Brecken, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the opportunity to make a comment, but it's related to all this, and it circles back to what we've been discussing about the small-scale artisanal miners, especially how it relates to here in Brazil. Because of the supply shortages, let's be real that as we go forward in the future, any commodity metals, gems, they're getting harder to find. That's just the reality of mining and geology. So but for Brazil here, if we can come up with a system to help those artisanal small-scale miners come online, there's many that would like to be formalized, but they just don't know how. So I just wanted to say that again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Do we have any other questions in the room? Well, if not, thank you so much, Brecken. It was really enlightening. And thank you very much. Well, our next speaker, it's a very popular one called Coffee Break. And we will resume in the room at 11:15 to the last section of the speakers of our proceedings. So enjoy coffee break and see you back in 16 minutes and 12 seconds. Thank you very much.